Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohanec, and today I'm going to fly solo and talk about the Humane Hoax. As you may know, I have written two books on this issue, this concept of the Humane Hoax. Some call it the Humane Myth. And I have founded a project called the Humane Hoax Project. And I know that we have some new listeners to the podcast. Welcome. At least maybe in the last year or so. I haven't really talked about the humane hoax issue for a while. I touch on it, of course, in interviews and when I can. It is an area that I have chosen to focus on dedicating an entire project to. I feel it is that important. So I was asked to be on a podcast for the Animal Studies channel, and they interview critical animal studies professors and animal advocacy authors. I was very honored to be asked to be on, and it's been a little bit of time since my book came out, and so it kind of forced me to go back through the book. And the host asked me some great questions that made me think even deeper about the subject, formulate and categorize things a little differently. So I thought I'd share some of that with you, some of my notes from that podcast. So even if you have heard me talk about the humane hoax before, it's always good to get a refresher for me too. And I've got some new stuff that I've thrown in here. I hope to encourage you, if you haven't gotten the book yet, to please get a copy for yourself. If you have a copy, maybe share it with someone else, get a copy for a friend or for your local library. Don't want it to get forgotten about. So I think that we're going to dedicate today's podcast to the humane hoax and kind of breaking down the book as well. So I'm going to be analyzing a humane meat ad that I feel is especially egregious, breaking down some of the harms of the humane hoax, and I talk a bit about language and labeling as well, since it's so incredibly connected. And I'll start by saying again that I feel that this is just such a critical area to learn about, to focus on. It's really our 21st century challenge. We, as animal advocates, did a great job over the past 3 decades of exposing industrial animal agriculture to the point that really, at this point, I think everyone could say that they're against factory farming, right? This term factory farming that we have really demonized the industry with, and to great effect, and rightly so. And I think now, most everyone would say they're against factory farming. But not everyone, in fact, not a large amount of people would say they're against animal farming, right? It used to be one and the same. It used to be the same thing, but not anymore, not in people's eyes, not in people's perception, even though it is still one and the same. But people's perceptions have changed and they think that there's some different path, that there's two different ways of farming animals or numerous different ways of farming animals. It's really interesting. I get ads for humane meat all the time on Facebook. I guess because I make posts with the word meat in them, right? In my text, I'll write speaking out against humane meat. And the algorithm just isn't savvy enough to know that I'm actually against meat. Like my whole career is about exposing the animal agriculture industry. It's kind of funny how poorly these things work in some instances. So I get these ads for like butcher's box or whatever. I can't remember the brand names, but supposedly humane meat companies. But getting these ads does give me insight into the industry, and it is very insidious. They really frame it as, like, you don't have to give up meat. You don't have to give up what you love. Our animals are happy. They're out in the grass. Don't you want to support us because we're doing it better, right? So there's a new label that we're seeing now that is popping up everywhere. I see it at Whole Foods. Chipotle's uses it a lot, and it's responsibly raised. So now all these labels like cage free and free range, well, they've been around a while. and they've been being debunked and exposed, right? So the industry has to kind of change its language. The marketing team gets together and they're like, okay, let's come up with something new. And one of those new ones is responsibly raised. And this one, it's sufficiently vague that it could mean just about anything, right? What do they mean? Ethically, environmentally? Well, it's whatever you want it to mean. It's whatever your concern is. Yeah, of course. We've done it responsibly, right? And Chipotle's has this phrase in an ad. It's a still image ad of a burrito. Okay, so the picture basically is a burrito, and the words are responsibly raised and unconditionally loved. Wow. So now we're getting into some really distorted thinking, right? I mean, beyond just misleading, some kind of warped thinking. I mean, very Orwellian here. So, first of all, what's pictured is a burrito, right? That's what we see that is supposedly responsibly raised and unconditionally loved. Well, of course, they're talking about the animal's flesh, the animal whose flesh is inside that burrito, right? The animal who was slaughtered and cut up. So people, when they see this ad, and they have no idea that the reality for that animal is essentially unchanged with these labels. There is still horrors going on that these animals face, no matter the label, no matter the farm. They still separate families. They're still performing painful body mutilations. They still go to slaughter at a very young age. The same slaughterhouse as all the other animals. There's no difference. The labels are unregulated. They mean so little, but these comforting words are reassuring. It helps us to feel better about the whole gruesome thing. There's a great chapter in the book, bringing it back to my book, The Humane Hoax, by John Sanbonmatsu. This chapter, I feel, was the most entertaining, certainly, chapter, really well written. And it talks about the concept of the femivore. Femivorism. It's the New York Times dubbed this kind of genre of literature femivorism. These women, mostly white women, that give up the corporate life and buy a plot of land and go out and farm. But they're not just farming plants, they are farming animals. And they use all this language of like mothering and caregiving, and that they're going to do it better and do it different than men, right? So there's all this really cognitive dissonance and contradiction going on when you're reading these passages. They're caring for and nurturing the animals until that fateful day, just weeks or months after their birth, where they're killed. And some of the women do the killing themselves, or have them shipped off. But how can we say that someone who we are sending to the slaughterhouse, that we're sending to their death in their youth, just months after they're born, was unconditionally loved? And using that language, unconditionally loved, to describe someone that you have commodified and that you are going to get money from their death. Wow. I mean, it's really kind of sick, really. I know that a lot of these people that are doing more, using humane labels, trying to do something a little different, I know that they go into it with good intentions. I think most of them do. I think most of them go into it with good intentions, thinking, we're gonna be able to do this better. But the reality, the reality of taking a sentient animal's life against his or her will, I think it sinks in for them too. I mean, I know so many humane farmers that are trying to do it better that eventually move on to just plant farming, get out of the business. They realize that there's just no way to do it humanely. Okay, so I'm going to shift to something a little different. So, one of the critiques that gets levied at me and my book, and people that are working on this issue, is they say, well, it goes something like this. Why are you focusing on just small farms and a small number of animals on these, farms that are trying to do it better? Why focus on them? They're not the bad guys. Focus on the industrial farming, the bad, big, CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. Let me address this question, this critique. So part of the humane hoax, part of the hoax itself, is that people assume, animal activists as well, vegans as well, assume that when there is a humane label, that it's a smaller farm. This is not necessarily the case. This is not necessarily true. Big ag, big corporations use the humane hoax as well. And that's actually the labels that we see the most. Just an example, Butterball Turkey. Butterball Turkey is the largest U.S. producer of turkey meat, and they use the American Certified Humane on all their products. They have it on every product. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of turkey, millions of turkeys on numerous farms, dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of farms across the U.S. Big ag uses these humane labels as well. So this label, the American Certified Humane label, let's talk about this label for just a minute. These labels are so industry friendly, right? That they often say things like that animals have to have adequate access to food and water. Well, yeah, they do. For the most part, of course they do. They're fattening them up to be slaughtered, so they have access to food. That's not one of the myriad cruelties they face. Those things aren't addressed, right? Under the American Certified Humane label, turkeys don't have to have access to the outside. They're still debeaked and detoed. And not many people know this about turkeys, but they often have their toes, the end of their toes, cut off at a very young age because when turkeys are threatened or frightened, they use their talons to defend themselves. Right. And in the crowded conditions, insensitive workers that have to move quickly and they're throwing the turkeys around, turkeys will defend themselves with their talons. And then other turkeys might get hurt. Workers can get hurt. So without anesthesia, when they're very young, they will cut the first or second digits of their toes off with just crude implements, sometimes just like plant shears, branch shears, and any kind of awful cutting implement. And this can cause lifelong crippling pain for these birds. Sometimes they walk with a limp for life after this detowing. But anyway, back to the label. The only thing that's needed to be awarded this label, the American Certified Humane label, is a few more inches of space per bird. So basically, all an operation has to do is they don't have to change anything about the building, about anything. They just have to reduce what's called the stocking density, how many birds are in the building, right? They just have to reduce that slightly. So there's a few less birds in the building. That's it. And while of course we want to give the animals more space, that's a good thing. That should not be the only thing required to be able to put a humane label on a product, right? It's awful. It's appalling. And it's not what people think of when they are looking at that certified humane label. They don't think that's the only thing that's changed, right? So just to clarify going forward, it is not just small farms that use these humane labels. It's not just a small number of animals that are under that label. Big industry is utilizing all of these labels as well. So just to clarify that, we're talking about lots and lots of animals, and it's more and more animals every day because more and more companies are using these labels. So this is growing. It's millions and millions of animals affected, and it's just getting bigger. So that is the response to that. Well, why focus on just a small number of animals? Well, it's not. Okay. So when I was giving this podcast, the interviewer asked if I could distinguish between three types of harms done to animals that are explained in the book, on so-called humane farms, operations that use these labels. First, harms that supposedly humane farms and conventional farms have in common. So what are the same harms? Second, harms that replace or are less bad than some of the harms done in industrial farming. And third, harms that are specific to supposedly humane farms, these farms using these labels, different ways that animals are harmed from these labels. And there are. And we point them out in the book. And that's why the interviewer knew to ask. To answer this question, I'll start with the harms that humane labels and conventional farming have in common. Okay. And this one's easy. It's basically everything. So the harms in common are multiple. These operations are predominantly the same. And when you really look into it from the animal's birth to death, so little changes for the reality of that animal, for the animal's experience. There's still the painful body mutilations like debeaking and castration and dehorning. None of that changes. A host of other terrible and violating things that they endure that's done to their bodies. There's also separation of families, right? Chicks not being hatched in a warm nest with a mother hen, but come into the world in a metal drawer, being immediately and violently tossed about like canned goods on a conveyor belt, baby calves being torn from their mothers at birth, this causing psychological distress to both the baby and the mother, all of that we already know. None of this changes. They all go to the same frightening slaughter at a very young age. None of that changes. All of these cruelties, they're inherent cruelties. They're baked into the animal product market that we have today. They're universal practices that can't be avoided if you want to have a profitable product. Like making changes to any of these practices would make the product too expensive. They just couldn't make money, right? So, moving on to the second question, what are the improvements? The slight improvements that do happen sometimes, that might be happening under these labels, it often has to do with confinement, right? The size of their confinement. And that's where the industry does have some wiggle room, where they can give the animals a bit more space. And that's what a lot of these so-called improvements come down to, right? Like cage-free eggs. Instead of chickens being confined in small battery cages stacked on top of one another, they are now in what are called floor systems, which are basically just a huge windowless warehouse with can be thousands of birds crammed into the floor of the building. And the change is so minimal. They still live their lives in their own waste, the ammonia burning their eyes and throats, never feeling the sun on their wings, all going to a brutal slaughter at a very young age, extreme monotony and ongoing distress. There are studies that show that there's actually higher mortality rates in cage-free farming. More birds die before they go to slaughter in cage-free farming than in conventional egg farming. I witnessed cage-free farms when I was researching for my first book, The Ultimate Betrayal. I went out to farms. I went to cage-free farms, free-range farms, conventional battery cage farms, and actually looked for myself. And what I saw shocked me. Birds that were living in operations that would put cage-free and free-range labels on their eggs were living in horrific conditions with their feathers like gone and birds dying in the corners of these places. It was just horrific. So getting back to the point, practically nothing changes between these labels other than the size of their confinement, which is just a small, small portion of the horrors they face. There is cruelty beyond the cage. Okay, so the third question, the third form of harm that the interviewer asked about, what are the harms that are unique to these labels that are occurring because of these labels? And when I was doing the research, that was the thing that was the most shocking, right? I thought, oh, well, at least if it's not improved, it's just the same, right? It's just kind of the same thing, just neutral. No, actually, it can be even worse in some cases. When they make slight changes, in some instances, it can get worse for the animals, both ethically for the animals and environmentally. Some examples where it can be even worse for the animals would be organic dairy and free-ranging pigs. And I'll talk about those two things. And free ranging, I mean, just talking about free ranging and throwing in a little greenwashing here, free ranging can be worse for the environment as well. To free range animals, we have to clear land for them, right? That means cutting down trees, filling in wetlands, slashing green spaces that are naturally sequestering carbon and put animals out there, right? That is not the direction we need to be going. So that's a whole nother story. And I've done a lot on greenwashing as well. Both of my books have a huge greenwashing section with a lot of good science and stats and studies. So if you want to hear more about the greenwashing, I've given presentations on it, and certainly the books have a lot of information. But getting back to the ethical and the animals. So organic dairy, this one was really eye-opening to me. In conventional dairy operations, it's really intensive. The animals are dirty and crowded, and they get diseases all the time. And one of those is mastitis. Mastitis is an infection of the udder. It can be very painful for the cows to be milked. Their udders can swell. There can be pus and blood. So farmers will give their cows antibiotics and pharmaceuticals to try to clear up the mastitis, right? Well, with organic dairy farming, the only thing that's really different is that the animals are fed organic grain and the animals are essentially drug-free, right? So no pharmaceuticals, no antibiotics. And this, of course, is for the health of the human, not the animal. This is so that the drugs passing through the milk to the human consumer, they're not getting those drugs. So what happens is the cows get mastitis on these organic dairies, and through the organic regulations, they can't give them the antibiotics and pharmaceuticals that would clear up their infections. And so they fester and they get worse. And when I was researching for my first book, I interviewed a veterinarian. He had been a vet for dairies for decades, and he said that he was now seeing cows with the worst cases of mastitis, huge infected udders, with so much pain at milking on organic dairies because the organic regulations don't allow them to give them the medications that they need. So now we have cows in extreme pain with advanced cases of mastitis on organic farms. So here's an example where it can be even worse for the animals. Just an aside about organic, though, I do feel that organic plant foods, organic plant farming is really good. I try to buy all organic myself. Certainly reducing our pesticide use and chemical use for plants is great. But when you apply it to animal foods, then you're denying those animals care that they need. So once again, let's not farm animals. Let's only farm plants. Organic only really works when it's plant farming. So, getting back to the kind of new and novel harms that we're seeing with shifting farming to try to be more environmental or more humane, another one of those is having animals being out on pasture, right? Pasture raised, grass fed, rotational grazing, all of these labels. There's this romanticized notion that if we just get the animals out of the confinement buildings and onto pasture, that this is going to solve all the problems of animal farming, right? That is not the case. Grass-fed, free-range, pasture-raised, and, first of all, they're not necessarily out in the field when you see this label. Oftentimes for free range, they're still, in a confinement building with chickens. For cows, there are places, when it's wintertime or up in the northern states where the grass is dead, the grass is brown. I know that there's operations that will buy cut grass from southern states, have it trucked up, and then feed their cows in the buildings grass, cut grass, and call their cows grass fed. So it's not necessarily that they're actually out on a field. But okay, so let's give them the benefit of the doubt. There are some operations, a very small number, pig and pork operations that do have the cows and pigs and chickens out on pasture. However, these are domesticated animals. These are not wild animals. You can't just throw them outside and think they can fend for themselves and everything's okay, right? There's a range of issues that they can face and sometimes suffer even worse when they're continuously outside. There are numerous studies that really underscore the myriad of problems with free ranging animals, putting animals out to pasture that compromises their well being. There was this fantastic meta-analysis that looked at numerous studies. A meta-analysis isn't just one study, it's a study that looks at other studies and comes to a conclusion. And it looked at numerous articles and studies between 2000 and 2020 called Animal Welfare and Production Challenges Associated with Pastured Pig Systems. And they found that pigs had exposure to extreme temperatures. In the summer, there was heat stress, not being able to get adequate shade. The lighter colored skinned animals like pink pigs for that lighter colored pork that everyone wants, they can get painful sunburn and blistering. In the winter, there was extreme cold, frostbite, piglets getting hypothermia and pneumonia. Animals are more vulnerable to predators. There's contact with wildlife and pathogens and parasites and viruses, avian flu. I mean, we're on the verge of another pandemic because of farming animals. Having animals out on pasture doesn't help. This study's cited in the first chapter of my book, The Humane Hoax. It's in the chapter by Ingrid Taylor. She has this incredible lived experience growing up on a small-scale pig farm. And I really love this chapter. It's titled A Pig Called Silver. And it's really, really a powerful chapter. It's why I made it the very first chapter of the book. So let's switch now to the last topic that I wanted to talk about, and that's the language and labels. So the interviewer asked me about language and terminology in the book. Part 3 of the book is called Language and Labels. And the language used around animals tells us a lot about our relationship with them, right? And this is where I'm going to bring in something that I often talk about, which is speciesism. Speciesism, if you're not familiar with this term, is, just think about racism or sexism or homophobia. Basically, it is considering one species dominant to other species. And as humans, we have deep-rooted speciesist tendencies and feel that we are superior to every other species on this planet. And it reflects in our language. So in the book, The Humane Hoax, I cite a survey by the Sentience Institute, and they surveyed people about their animal product consumption, and they found that 58% of people think that farmed animals are treated well, and 75% believe that the products they purchase come from animals that are treated humanely. Quote, animals that are treated humanely. Wow. So I really believe that the presence of alternative and humane labels in the market exacerbates this effect, right? It's appeasing consumers into this false sense that there is an industry-wide movement towards better conditions for farmed animals when in reality, none exists. In reality, it's just getting worse. But they see these labels and they see the images of the happy cows and see reassuring words like humane and responsibly raised. And they assume that, there's an industry-wide trend to better conditions. But that is not the reality. The Sentience Institute proposed in the conclusion of their study, they said, quote, This suggests a psychological refuge effect where people justify their animal product consumption by incorrectly assuming they're eating ethically produced food. And these labels are just making that worse. We compartmentalize animals into categories, right? Wild animal, pet, food animal. And language helps to shape our views on this. Species is language that puts the animals into different camps for different uses, even though these animals are just the same, feel the same pain, feel the same emotion. The industry uses language to manipulate, to weave narratives that are comforting to shoppers, also to make us feel that some animals are different than others. Some animals maybe feel more, feel less, are more intelligent, less intelligent. There's a fantastic chapter in the book, in the Humane Hoax, by Devanathan Nair. It's called Corrupting the Language of Animal Welfare. And this is a quote from that book. It is also the crafty use of language in the stories that we tell ourselves that allows us to fawn over an animal at the zoo and still be able to consume another animal a few moments later for lunch without raising too many existential qualms. So, language has a huge impact on how we see animals, how we use animals, and we really need to be conscious of this with the labeling and the imagery on the websites. That is language too. The visual input from the websites, from the images, video, that's all language as well. It's telling a story, right? And they are telling a story that is not reality, that is not the truth. And we have to find ways to share the animal's true story. So, just some final thoughts in conclusion on the humane hoax. These labels, these supposedly new ways of farming animals, these are all reforms, right? These are internal reforms, reforms that the industry is proposing. And I would argue that we cannot reform our way out of farmed animal suffering. We can't trust animal producers to reform their own business any more than we could trust the fossil fuel industry to do the right thing and stop drilling for oil. Self-regulation never works. This is an industry that can't be reformed. The end product is the flesh of sentient beings, the bodily fluids of sentient beings. Those cannot be obtained humanely. You cannot humanely commodify and kill animals. We have to embrace the urgency and realize that we cannot just reform ourselves out of this suffering. We can't just reform ourselves out of this massive environmental destruction that this industry causes. These industries take babies away from their mothers. They cause psychological distress to sentient beings. They are brutally slaughtering innocent animals. The animal agriculture industry is so destructive, so cruel, so damaging that I believe they are unreformable and need to be dismantled and replaced with healthy plant-based foods. We can't label ourselves out of this problem. And again, we can't rely on the farmers and ranchers and suppliers and marketers and retailers to make these critical changes. As long as there's profit to be made, they will not give it up. It's up to us on a grassroots level, on a personal level, to make the change necessary. We need to boycott this cruel and horrible industry. We need to demand vegan food everywhere we go. And we need to encourage farms to transition to plant farming. These humane labels disguise the reality. The feel-good marketing, it weaves a narrative that people want to believe, so it's hard for them to not believe it, to see the truth. But there is cruelty beyond the cage. And eliminating animal products and ultimately dismantling the animal farming industry is the only way to assure that all animals will be free of human-imposed suffering. So, Compassionate Living has our Humane Hoax project, and we have a dedicated team of volunteers, and we are looking for people that are passionate about this issue to help, especially with social media and video work, but in other ways as well. So, if you are interested in being on our team, please let me know. And do check out our website, humanehoax.org, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And I'll wrap up on a positive note. Why do people seek out humane labels? Why are people buying it? It's because they care. They care about animals. They don't want to see animals suffer. I think the majority of people that you would ask would say they love animals and they don't want to see animals suffer. These products wouldn't sell if people didn't care. So that is really hopeful. So I think that it's just a matter of exposure, of time, of the truth coming out. This is just a stage that we have to go through to get where we are going. And the logical progression, the logical conclusion of treating animals humanely is that we don't commodify and kill them, right? I mean, I believe we will get there. People will, they're going to put it all together, but we can't be complacent and think that people are going to get there on their own because the marketing and the labels are lying to them. So we have to be that voice of truth. We have to tell the animals' stories, show that anytime an animal is commodified, no matter the label, there's exploitation, there is abuse, there is suffering. I believe it is the care and concern and love and compassion of everyday people like you and me that will end farmed animal suffering. We just have to reach them. And I believe that this book is part of helping to reach them. So help me to do that. Help me to get this book out into the world. Buy a copy for a friend, buy a copy for your local library, share about it on social media. You can find it on Lantern Publishing and Media. That's the publisher. This book has critical information for our veganism, our activism today, as we fight these false narratives about some humane way to perform the most violent acts. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. Please share this podcast and live vegan.